Like anything that we understand about at all with regard to things as complicated as human affairs, the answers are pretty trivial. If they're not trivial, we don't understand it. There is a category of intellectuals who are undoubtedly perfectly sincere, who, if you look at it from the outside, what they're actually doing is using polysyllabic words and complicated constructions, which apparently they seem to understand because they talk to each other. Most of the time I can't understand what the heck they're talking about. Even people who are supposed to be in my field. It's all very inflated and, a lot of prestige and so on. That has a terrible effect in the third world. In the first world, the rich countries, it doesn't really matter that much. So if a lot of nonsense goes on in the Paris cafes or the Yale comparative literature department, well, okay. On the other hand, in the third world, popular movements really need serious intellectuals to participate. And if they're all ranting postmodern absurdities, well, they're gone. I mean, I've seen real examples, could give them to you. But so there is that category. And it's considered very left-wing and very advanced and so on and so forth. Well, some of what appears in it actually makes sense. But when you reproduce it in monosyllables, it turns out to be truisms. So yes, it is perfectly true that if you look at scientists in the West, they're mostly men. And it's perfectly true that women have had a hard time breaking into scientific fields. And it's perfectly true that there are institutional factors determining how science proceeds that reflect power structures. I mean, all of this can be described literally in monosyllables, and it turns out to be truisms when you...
Clearly,
okay. On the other hand, you don't get to be a respected intellectual by presenting truisms in monosyllables. Now, a lot of the left criticism... So when the left, so-called left criticism, I don't consider it left, when the left criticism, so-called, happens to be accurate, well, okay, that's fine. So if you point out a lot of things, just like what I mentioned, there are a lot of them, no, that's fine. Point it out, everybody can understand it, you take a look, you see it's true, and so on. On the other hand, a lot of the so-called left criticism seems to be pure nonsense. In fact, that's been demonstrated conclusively. So there's a very important book by Jean Brickman and Alan Sokal, I forget what it's called, Dangerous Illusions or something, where they simply go through they happen to concentrate on Paris, which is the center of the rot, but it's all over. And they go through the most respected French intellectuals and run through what they say about science. And, it is so embarrassing that you kind of cringe when you read it. Actually, sometimes, one of my most striking ones is one of the very few who actually is a scientist and knows something about science. Latour has a background in science and philosophy of science. They go through an article of his, and I think I'm remembering it correctly, in which somebody in France or somewhere had discovered that one of the pharaohs had died of tuberculosis, and they did it by analysis of whatever DNA or something. Latour wrote an article ridiculing this because it's totally absurd.
Because nobody had talked about it.
Tuberculosis was only discovered in the 19th century. How could and everything's a social construction, and
therefore it wasn't constructed yet.
So it didn't happen. I mean, it's kind of at the level of Bush and Chirac, yeah. But it's taken very seriously, and this is considered very leftist.
But one point to look at, I think, is that the description of intellectuals, the description of journalists, and now the description of this sector of part of what calls itself the left, you have something similar going on, even though the price is much lower. You have those guys sitting in the air-conditioned rooms bombing the hell out of the world for their careers, for their status, because of their reflexive lessons that they've learned. And then over here you have people who are in literary criticism or whatever field they might be in, who are also completely divorced from reality or obscuring it or dolling it up for similar reasons. Of course, the price is much less. I mean, it's high, but it's...
In the third world,
yeah.
it's high.
But it's
in
still
rich countries, it's just a pain in the neck.
still not like
But
bombing the world.
yeah, I think.
But it's
the
the
reasons
same
are
phenomenon.
They're hard to understand. I mean, they're nice people. A lot of them are friends, and if you look at what's happening, I think it's pretty easy to figure out what's going on. I mean, suppose you're a literary scholar at some elite university, or anthropologist or whatever. I mean, if you do your work seriously, that's fine, but it's not very. I mean, you don't get any big prizes for it. On the other hand, you take a look over in the rest of the university, and you got these guys in the physics department and the math department, and they have all kind of complicated theories, which of course we can't understand, but they seem to understand them, and they have principles, and they deduce complicated things from the principles, and they do experiments, and they find either they work or they don't work, and that's really impressive stuff. So I want to be like that too. So I want to have a theory in literary, in the humanities, literary criticism, anthropology, and so on. There's a field called theory. We're just like the physicists. They talk incomprehensibly. We can talk incomprehensibly. They have big words. We'll have big words. They draw, far-reaching conclusions. We'll draw far-reaching conclusions. We're just as prestigious as they are. Now, if they say, well, look, we're doing real science and you guys aren't, that's white, male, sexist, bourgeois, whatever the answer is. How are we any different from them? Okay, that's appealing. And there are other things that went on. Remember that a lot of this stuff comes from Paris. And interesting things were happening in Paris in the 1970s. The French intellectuals were the last group of intellectuals in the world who were dedicated, overwhelmingly, not 100%, but it was very standard and respected to be a dedicated Stalinist and Maoist. Okay, by the mid-70s, I was getting to be a pretty hard position to uphold. So what you had, if you take a look at what happened, is there was a sudden shift. People who had been flaming Maoists and Stalinists suddenly became the first people in the world to have discovered the Gulag, and went on a tear about how everyone else supports, Stalinist and Maoist atrocities, and we're France, of course, so we have to be in front of everyone. So therefore, we've exposed it, and now it was called the New Philosophy, or New Philosophers or something, and it went over all kinds. I mean, I remember meeting, I won't mention names because it's embarrassing, one of the leading French cultural theorists who happened to visit me around 1974, and she was a flaming Maoist. A couple of years later, she was one of the first people to have understood, to have discovered Stalinist and Maoist atrocities. Well, okay, when you went through that transition, you got to do something else. How are you going to be, on the front pages? Okay, along comes the invention of post-structuralism.